If a person becomes tamei while they're inside the Beis Hamikdash, they have to make sure they don't stay there longer than necessary. The question is, how long is longer than necessary? And as we shall see, what the Rambam teaches us about this also carries a very powerful lesson about our relationship with and dedication to Hashem. In Hilchos Beis Hamikdash, in the halachas about entering and being in the Beis Hamikdash, the Rambam tells us, as when is nit megivorim b'Hamikdash, if a person became tamei while they were in the Beis Hamikdash, is the din, the halach is, as yimar v'vol v'yetz b'derech tzara, should hurry and agitate to get out of there as quickly as possible, and therefore v'asaloi lishois, a person may not delay their exit, oy lishtachves, nor may a person bow down while in the Beis Hamikdash while they're tamei, oy latzis b'derech haruka, nor may they take a long route out of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so how long is considered a delay? When it comes to how long a delay or bowing is, he says as follows: how long is too long to stay in the Beis Hamikdash? Kedei, it's the amount of time that it takes to read this pasuk. It's a pasuk that describes how the Yidden in Divrei Yomim, how they bowed down in the Beis Hamikdash after they saw a revelation of godliness, and they said, and then he repeats, and that is the time frame for bowing. So he says it's the time frame for delay and for bowing. Zok the Kesef Mishnah, so the Kesef Mishnah says, the Mokif and Divrei Rambam is Masechta Shavuos state that the Rambam sources in Gemara Shavuos where it says as follows: Kamo shiur, how long is too long to delay your stay in the Beis Hamikdash if you are tamei? Pligi ba tzmachloikas. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmeni v'chad deimei chulei. It's a machloikas between Rabbi Yitzchak bar Nachmeni and one of his colleagues. Chad Omer, one says the maximum amount of time you can be there is kemeimre dahai psuka, the time that it takes to read that entire pasuk. Chad Omer, the other says no, it's not the whole pasuk, but rather ki mivayichru lesefa, from the word vayichru that they bowed till the end of the pasuk. And what led to this in context of the pasuk is that they all saw the fire of the Eibishter in the Beis Hamikdash, which was obviously a sign of the Shechina. And then here's the pasuk: Vayichru apayim outside the ritzvah. They bowed down to the floor. And they bowed, saying, "Blessed is Hashem." And also, the Rambam Paskan says the Kesef Mishnah. You have two opinions over here: is it the longer pasuk or only part of the pasuk? So the Rambam Paskan Achmed. The Rambam takes the stricter view, which is that you have a shorter period of time. It's the part of the opinion that says that you only read part of the pasuk. That's the length of time that is considered a delay. Not like the opinion that said that's the amount of time to read the entire pasuk. The mashma, where that expression implied that you got the enough time that it takes to say the whole pasuk. So then the Kesef Mishnah answers, you might have thought that the opinion in the Gemara Shavuos that said you say the whole pasuk didn't mean the whole pasuk, it meant the first half of the pasuk, as opposed to the second opinion that said it's the second half of the pasuk. Maybe the Rambam is actually being more lenient and giving us a longer span of time. And if you're going to go from that perspective, then you're saying that the Rambam is actually more lenient because he's going with the lesser period of time. That is, from Vayichru to the end of the pasuk. Vaita shaip the Kesef Mishnah. Then the Kesef Mishnah, that's the Gemara Yerushalmi, the Gemara Talmud Bavli in Shavuos. Now the Kesef Mishnah is going to say that there's a similar debate in the Gemara Yerushalmi. As we shall see, the approach of the Bavli and Yerushalmi are quite different. The Yerushalmi says, how long is the amount of time that is considered to be bowing, which you're not allowed to do when you're tamei in the Beis Hamikdash? So the first opinion is that it's until you get to the part of the pasuk Rabbi Abo Moisif and then Rabbi Abo says, no, you actually have more time than that, because you can also add more words to the pasuk, which gives you a longer amount of time that you could be in the Beis Hamikdash before you have to leave. So now, based on that, the Kesef Mishnah says, look, looking at the Yerushalmi, now we know for sure that there's an opinion that says that there is just the first part of the pasuk. And that's it. You don't have to say you don't include the whole part of and they said etc. And therefore, whoever's going according to the opinion that says Vayichru till the end of the pasuk is actually being more mekel, because giving you more time. And maybe actually the Rambam's giving us more time, is being more mekel. Now, so the Kesef Mishnah has given us two options over here. That the one version is the Rambam is actually more machmir, and the other is that he's more makil, and the Mefarshim ask questions on this. First of all, when the Kesef Mishnah quoted the Gemara in Shavuos and said that the opinion who says say the whole pasuk didn't mean the whole pasuk, he only meant the first part of the pasuk. What's the logic to say such a thing? So there's nothing in the Gemara that alludes to that actually being the interpretation of what Meimrei Dahai Psuka means. Und der zweite Tirutz, the second explanation, as Meimrei Dahai Psuka meint no kedei vayichra pai ma'aseh vayishtachel belvad, suggesting that Meimrei Dahai Psuka actually just means that it's from Vayichru to the end of the pasuk, and that also needs to be understood. That if the Gemara only means that the amount of time that a person may remain in the Beis Hamikdash is the amount of time to read part of the pasuk, then why quote the whole pasuk? Because the way that the Kesef Mishnah has explained it, there is no opinion who says you read the entire pasuk. It's either until the word Vayichru or from the word Vayichru. So why did the pasuk have to appear in the Gemara? When we bring in them ganze pasuk, Gemara goes says to him. In fact, the Gemara might be confusing us by quoting the whole pasuk, because maybe you think there's an opinion that says you have to stay the amount of time that it takes to read the entire pasuk. Oich, another question. How's it possible that you look at that expression, which sounds like a very straightforward statement? The amount of time it takes to say this pasuk. From pasuk. How could you extract from that it means actually only start from the middle of the pasuk? In fact, not to look from the beginning of the pasuk where they saw the fire, and not to go all the way to the end of the pasuk where they say Hoidel Hashem Ki Tov. Where would you get such an opinion from? So in order to understand what the Kesef Mishnah is telling us, or what the Rambam is telling us, we have to pay attention to the specific language that the Rambam used. First of all, let's pay attention to what the Rambam said. He said, how long is the amount of time that is considered a delay once a person is tummy, which is now osur? Is kedei likros vayichru, tells us what you have to read, and then he repeats, and that is the amount of time that is considered bowing. Why is the Rambam splitting this into two things? First, he tells us that this is the amount of time that is considered a delay, and then he tells us that is the amount of time that is considered bowing. Why doesn't it just say simply? How long is the period that is considered a delay or considered bowing? To read this part of the pasuk. I'll say the reason is because what the Rambam is speaking about over here follows on from something to diverta, something else that the Rambam said before, which is going to be a key part of what we're analyzing over here. He says, let's say a person is now headed out of the Beis Hamikdash, and he doesn't turn around as one should towards the Heichal and bows, but rather he bows in the direction facing the exit. Such a person is not chayev for yishtach avoya, unless he also delayed the amount of time that is considered a delay, and therefore he's, at this point it would seem, liable for the delay, not for the bowing. And then continue from that. He says, now that we've said that you're not chayev for bowing unless it's the amount of time that is considered a delay, now the practical question to ask is, how long is considered a delay? Okay, so you want to say that that's the reason the Rambam took that approach. Still doesn't make sense in the language. Rather, what the Rambam should have said very clearly is, what the Rambam should have said is that if a person is on their way out and then they bow, they're only chayev if they bow as long as bowing is constituted in halacha. And then you'll ask, how long is that? How long is that considered? Or how long is considered the period of time that is considered bowing? The amount of time it takes to read this pasuk. And that would be much more similar to the language of the Mishnah, which is where the person is considered liable because he bowed, or he waited as long as it takes to bow. Second thing we have to pay attention to, please. Surely, when the Rambam's discussing the question of how long is considered a delay to leave the Beis Hamikdash, he's not only talking in the context of this very specific scenario, that he didn't turn back towards the Heichal, but he bowed on his way to the exit. that then he's only chayiv if it was as long as a delay is considered. And then we're going to say, how long is a delay? Now, if the surely if the Rambam is speaking about how long is considered a delay, is talking across the board, any scenario that has to do with the delaying of exiting the Beis Hamikdash. Because it's already told us in the previous halacha that a person may not delay the exit from the Beis Hamikdash. And if you did, you've transgressed. So surely he's addressing that and saying, how long is the delay? Aber was sagt der Rambam der Shir wie stachvoy darf in der Loch beim Schach zu dem Din wenn loy hechse ponne will stachve derch jetzt jose klapi khutz and khayven kein shokeshir. How come when the Rambam wants to get into what should be a foundational principle about how long is considered a delay, does he specifically peg it to that story of the person who's bowing on their way out? Und sagt das nicht in der Friedike Loch beim Schach zum etzem Isur von Shia. Why doesn't the Rambam tell us about the time frame of a delay when he spoke about the halacha that you may not delay your exit? That you're not allowed to delay leaving. Then he should have said, how long is a delay? To read Vayikra. In other words, clearly the Rambam is making some kind of link between delay and bowing, and we need to understand that link because it will help us to understand what the Rambam's opinion is. Shlomo Abir Bozed explanation is this. From Pashas L'Shein Rambam, if you take the Rambam's language at face value, where he says, what did he tell us? You're not allowed to delay your exit, you're not allowed to bow, and you're not allowed to take a long route out. And if a person delayed, or took a long route, even if it wasn't a delay, or he turned around and faced the Heichel and bowed down, even if that didn't really delay him, in all three of those scenarios, Chayiv Koris, he is liable for Koris. Is move on from the way the Rambam says it. It's very clear that as do is nit ein chiv, was hat nit mehr gewen lass es bederch getzara. There's no one single generic prohibition against not rushing out of the Beis Hamikdash. Was can sich stellen in drei von him, and that not rushing out could manifest in one of three ways. Shaha, you delayed your exit. Ishtachvo, you bowed before you left. Or yatsa derech haruko, you took a longer route. The Rambam is making it clear to us there are three different prohibitions over here for which there are three different possibilities of being liable. Drei bazundre shemus, each one with its own name. There's a prohibition and liability if a person delays exiting the Beis Hamikdash. And that liability would be because you extended the time that you hung around in the Beis Hamikdash. Or there's another concept, which is if a person bows towards the Heichal, even if it does not delay the exit at all, that's a different chiv. Which means because you bowed, that is a transgression. And then there's another prohibition, which is taking a longer route out, even if it doesn't technically take more time, where the prohibition is the way you chose to leave the Beis Hamikdash. Now that we know that the Rambam is looking at three different concepts related to this issue of delaying your exit from the Beis Hamikdash, we can now focus into and pick apart the specific halacha we wanted to know, which is what happens if a person bowed not towards the Heichal, because that's already ishtachavah, which is already aser. But this person is bowing on their way out, where the Rambam says that scenario would only be liable if it delayed in the period of time that is called delay. So the question is, so it's clear, he's chayiv. He bowed on his way out and it delayed him. He's chayiv. Is he chayiv because he bowed? Is that the halachic definition? Or is he chayiv because he delayed? Is that the halachic definition? In other words, the two ways we could look at this. The first way we could look at it is, the problem is he bowed. And bowing is prohibited when a person is tummy. No, the only thing is he bowed in an unusual way. He didn't bow like you're supposed to towards the Heichal. He's now facing the opposite direction. Therefore, we introduce a new layer to the halacha, which is it's not automatically considered bowing unless the bowing takes as long as a delay would be. Then the hishtachavo is considered hishtachavo, and then it's chayav for bowing. Or we could say Beis, he's not liable for the fact that he bowed. That's irrelevant. Was plastic because he's bowing the wrong direction. It's not considered bowing. Nor mitzad yeshia. The reason he's liable is because the bowing delayed him the period of time that is considered a delay, and that is aser, therefore he's chayiv. But I've given it halachic. In a moment, we're going to see that there are practical halachic implications, but let's first understand this. L'chayra, Shlomo astos the Chelek in the Tzvei L'shonos HaGemara b'divrei Rava. Maybe it's these two perspectives that help us understand the Gemara's two versions of how Rava saw this halacha. If the Mishnah, let's go back to Shavuos. The Mishnah said, "Ishtachva oy sheshah bichdei ishtachava." If a person bowed or he delayed his exit the amount of time it takes to bow, he's liable. Zog the Gemara tells us, Amar Rava says, "Lo yishana l'shishtachva klapi pnim." The only time he's liable for bowing is if he bows towards the heichal. But if he bowed with his back to the heichal, which is inappropriate, then if that bowing delayed in the period of time that is called a delay, then is liable. And if it was less than that, he's not liable. That's the first version of Rava's opinion. There are others who apply Rava's opinion to the latter part of the Mishnah, where it said, or he delayed his exit as long as it takes to bow, which seems to indicate that in order for bowing to be considered liable, the bowing has to be as long as your delay of exit. Rabbi explains, I'll explain why that is. The only time that we measure how long his bowing is if he bowed towards the exit. But if he bowed correctly towards the heichal, even if it was very brief, still he'd be liable. That's what the Mishnah meant to say. Sorry, let's read it again. If a person bowed towards the heichal, automatically he's liable. Or when it tells us he waited the period of time that it takes to bow, that's when he's facing the wrong way, chayav. In other words, bowing towards the heichal is automatically chayav. Bowing away from the heichal has to have a shir kedei shehiyah. And the Gemara gets into the question, how long is considered ishtachava? At first glance, it doesn't seem to be a clear difference between the two opinions of Rava, except now that we've explained this, you can see that there is a clear difference, because practically it doesn't seem to be saying anything different, but conceptually saying something very different. Now we can see what the distinction between the two views of Rava is, or the two views quoted in Rava's name. Loit and Esh and Losh in the first opinion, as David Rava Gatev and Vorti Shtachavo Shebereisha. What is Rava analyzing? The word Hishtachavo, bowing. He says, what does Hishtachavo mean? It means if you're bowing towards the Eichel. Kumtois, from that perspective, it emerges as Klapichutzis Nito the ganze Gede von Hishtachavo. That means that if you're not facing the Heichal, it's not considered bowing. The person is not liable because of bowing, as we've said, that the chiyuv is not ishtachava, the chiyuv is shiyah. Therefore, that's why Rava says, if a person is bowing away from the heichal, which is not considered bowing, then the only question is, shaha or not? Did he fulfill the time frame that is considered a delay in which he's liable, or no? In other words, as Klapichutz is don't know the get achiv mitzat shaha. In other words, Rava, in that first version of Rava, is saying that if a person bows with their back to the heichal, the only consideration is time period, not the action that they did. Rashi actually points this out, where he says that if a person bows to the east, which is his back to the heichal, that's not considered bowing. But if he waited the period of time that we've defined as the length of time that a person is liable, which is the amount of time that it takes to bow, then the person is liable not for having bowed, but for having delayed his exit. And if it's not as long as that, there is no transgression, because that bowing is not considered bowing. Whereas, when you see the second version of Rava's opinion, which is Asdas Gatev to say that the focus is not the word ishtachava, but rather on the second part of the Mishnah, which said that he remained in the Beis Hamikdash the period of time it takes to bow. That implies that the definition of bowing is it's got to be a certain amount of time, otherwise it's not considered bowing, because it says that implies that it doesn't matter which direction the person is facing when he bows, the halachic parameters of bowing apply. Because in this version, Rava is saying it's only when he's bowing in the wrong direction That's when we say, well, let's measure how long that bowing was, and then you'll be liable. But if he faced the correct direction, he faced the heichal to bow, we don't have to consider time frames. In other words, he's saying, bowing away from the heichal will constitute bowing, provided it's as long as the minimum shear of bowing. You can also see this in Rashi's language, where he says, when Rashi comments on the second version of Rabbi's opinion, this is what it means. If he bowed towards the heichal, whereas if he bowed away from the heichal, you have to wait to see if it's the amount of time of Yishtachavo. Rashi says, this is what it means to say that if you're bowing towards the heichal, any amount of bowing, any time frame, the person is liable. Listen to the language he uses. But if the person is facing away from the heichal and he bows, how long does he bow? The amount of time that you are liable for bowing, not for delaying. Because if a person is bowing facing the exit, that bow has to last long enough to be considered chayev. How long is considered chayev? The shir shtachava. In other words, klape chutz is doch nicht tolerant if Rashi in the Meshul Lashon the ganze chipin is shtachava no shia. What's Rashi pointing out? That when you're facing away from the heichal, it's not considered an automatic gather of bowing. You need a time frame. So if Rashi wanted us to say that it's just that the time frame makes you chayev, he would have said kedei shia. But he doesn't. He says kedei shiur chiyuv ishtachavo. That means that there is this concept of a bowing, considered bowing when it's a certain amount of time. But and Rashi should have said that again in the conclusion of his interpretation. You need the period of time that is considered a delay. He doesn't say that. You need shiur chiyuv, he tells us. Shloimer, as Rashi is the mitmadish, so Rashi is clearly emphasizing, as we've learned, as oich klapi chutz is the chiv nitzad ishtachavo, that the geder, the halachic transgression that a person does when bowing with their back to the heichal is still the transgression of bowing, not this transgression of delay, provided it's long enough. Not the ishtachavo, but shechiv has to be a certain amount of time. Now you'll say, so what's the difference? If a person delayed that amount of time without bowing, they'd also have transgressed. They would have transgressed delaying. So what's the difference? Because as we've illustrated, the Rambam says there are three categories of potential isur that could apply over here. Is the isur dafka omad kedei shehiyah? So therefore the implication is that to qualify as transgressing because you waited in the Beis Hamikdash, you'd actually have to be still in one place to be waiting and delaying. But if you're doing something during that same time frame, in this case there is a mishtachve, the person is bowing, even though he's bowing the wrong direction, no longer qualifies as a delay. Delay means you're staying put. So we have to know that the reason for the transgression and therefore the chiyuv kares is because of the category called bowing, not the category called delaying. Right? Very important distinction. And there's a practical difference of how the halacha would apply depending on which opinion you look at, and that is the gabei chatzi shir. We know that there's a principle that in order to transgress certain averos, you have to have a minimum amount of either the thing you partake of, or let's say you're writing letters on Shabbos or whatever the case is. What if you do half the shir? Let's say a person needs half a kazai Yom Kippur. So as Rabbi Yochanan as chatzi shir asim min haTorah. Rabbi Yochanan, and we follow Rabbi Yochanan the halacha, says that if you transgress half the amount, you have transgressed, and that's a Torah prohibition. And there are opinions that say that only applies to food, but there are also opinions that say that it applies to other things, not only food, and that's where we're going to go with this. So the concept of half a measure making you liable is only if the item is half the measure. Let's give an example. It's a single action, but you just didn't do it with the qualifying amount. So let's say, for example, so the Torah says you're not allowed to eat tray food. The amount that you have to eat in order to technically be liable is a kazais. What if a person ate half a kazais? Still the same action. It's still eating, and it's still eating treif. So Rabbi Yochanan says, chatzizais also min ha-Torah. So maybe you won't be liable, but it's also forbidden. Another example. Let's say there are a whole string of different sizes and weights that qualify as transgressing Shabbos by carrying something from a personal to a public domain. What happens if a person carried less than the amount? So you can't be liable because you didn't carry the full amount. Still also is forbidden. Same action. I'm moving something from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. I'm just moving less than what is punishable. But if the half I'm doing is not half the amount, but half the action, let's say I do half a melacha. So you're liable for writing 2 letters on Shabbos. What if a person wrote 1 letter? That's not forbidden by Torah. It's also d'Rabbanan. It's not also min Torah because you've broken the action in half, not just the quantity of what is involved in your action. Okay, let's translate that into our case. Let's go with the first view. That the reason that person was not allowed to bow on his way out of the Beis Hamikdash, and it's now liable, is not because of bowing, but because it delayed his exit. So let's say that the amount of time this whole thing took was less than the allocated time that is considered shehiyah delay, then we don't call that chatzi shir, we say the action never happened. You didn't actually delay. Because delay is not you take X amount of seconds and put them all together, and then all together that is considered a delay. It's rather that when X amount of time passes, now the reality changes. Now you're considered to have been delayed. So there's no such thing as half a delay. Either you're delayed or you're not delayed. So therefore, if the guy quickly bowed on the way out and it wasn't Kadeshiyah, not Chayv at all. Or it's not Asr, let's say. Chayv is for sure not. But it's not Asr. So if that's how we're looking at it, less than a delay is not considered a delay at all. And so we can't apply this concept of a partial delay or half a delay. But if we say that the reason why this person is chayev when he bowed on the way out is because it's considered bowing, the only thing is he's bowing the wrong way, so therefore in order for it to constitute bowing it has to be long enough. Then you're telling me that there's an amount of time that this bowing has to continue to be considered bowing. Then it's not that the delay makes the Isser, it's rather that the delay measures when the Isser has kicked in. Then if a person bowed for part of that time, it's still Asr. Not punishable, but Asr. It's not long enough to make him liable for Kores, but still forbidden. Whereas if I say it's because of Shia, if I didn't take as long as Shia it constitutes, it's not even Asr. Okay, so far we have 2 perspectives. Either there's no such concept of shtachava unless you're facing the heichal, and therefore the only reason the person is liable is because of Shia delay, or we're saying there is such a concept of shtachava wherever it is in the Beis Hamikdash, but if it's not facing the heichal, it needs to be a minimum amount of time in order for it to qualify. Now we're going to look at a third possibility, and as we shall see, this is the possibility the Rambam takes. There's another perspective. That when a person bows facing away from the heichal, he is not liable because he delayed his exit. Now, the reason he's liable is because he bowed, as we've already looked at. But here's where things are going to change. Up until now, we said there's an opinion that says bowing in any direction in the Beis Hamikdash is problematic if the person is tamei. How do we measure if the person has bowed? How long did it take? So the shir shehiyah makes it ishtachava. Now the shir machtuftim shtei mishtachava, but now we're seeing a different perspective, which is if the bowing was long enough, only then do we call it bowing. In other words, previously we said if a person bows, it's called bowing, no matter where he's bowing. He's only liable if it's long enough. He has a third perspective. It's only considered bowing if it's long enough. In other words, if you're not bowing towards the heichal, it's not considered bowing. But if a person bows long enough that is considered kedei shehiyah or kedei ishtachavo. In ishtachavo klapi chutz when you're facing the wrong direction. Vetter mit a geder from ishtachavo. That now reintroduces ishtachavo to this particular scenario. In other words, ishtachavo is usually facing the heichal. Now you're not facing the heichal, but if it's long enough, it reintroduces the geder of ishtachavo. Over meile is a chayv el ishtachavo, and therefore the person is liable for bowing. Shlemas das shittas Rambam would appear that that's the Rambam's perspective, and therefore we'll understand how and why the Rambam said the things that he said. On the Rebbe, Aleph. Therefore, first of all, therefore the Rambam specifies that if a person did not bow towards the heichal but rather on his way out, he says the person will only be liable if that took as long as the shiur which is allocated. Beis, second of all, then he tells us what the shiur is. The part of the pasuk from Vayichru to the end of the pasuk. In der halacha, and he tells it to us in this halacha, need freer veneret wegen der betzim iser shehiyah. He doesn't tell us this information when he introduced the general principle that you may not delay your exit from the Beis Hamikdash. He's specifying that it's the shiur for making ishtachavo in the wrong direction turn into ishtachavo, and that's why he concludes Gimel Firtos Vezeu shir ishtachavoya. He tells us this is the measure of bowing. Let's say the Rambam had said, as we wanted him to say, that even if he waits the period of time of bowing without telling us, and this pasuk is the period of time, so we would have thought, listen, if a person is bowing away from the heichal, that could fall into the category of the transgression of bowing. But in order for it to be the transgression of bowing, you have to have a period of time. Therefore, the Rambam spelled it out for us, that the person is not chayiv unless he bowed for long enough. How long is long enough, he tells us. And then he reiterates, and that is not the length of time of delaying your exit, but specifically, that is the length of time of bowing. So the Rambam's highlighting two parts to us. As mitzad atzmo is nito can get of nishtachavo klapi chutz. First, it's telling us, in and of itself, there's no such concept as bowing if it's not towards the heichal. Whereas, but if that bow was long enough, that will create a paradigm that this is considered bowing. Vashir sheyosei, how long is that? That's the period of time. We're still going to explain why that has to be the part of the pasuk. On the far sagt es der Rambam behemshach zu der Halacha, wo es redt wegen der Shir wenn ich stach mit der Chitziyosei. That's why the Rambam tells us this time frame, not when he introduces the generalized concept, don't delay your exit, but specifically the person who's bowing in the wrong direction on his way out. He's not going to tell us the time frame when he says, don't delay your exit from the Beis Hamikdash. Nothing to do with ishtachavo. Because the Rambam wants us to know that the halachic definition of the transgression of bowing in the wrong direction is not under the umbrella of delaying your exit from the Beis Hamikdash, but rather this is a time frame that reintroduces the possibility of transgressing bowing in the Beis Hamikdash, even if you're bowing in the wrong direction. So therefore, let's try the alternative. Let's say that the Rambam did give us this time frame when he was talking about the overall principle that you may not delay your exit from the Beis Hamikdash. I was there, okay, fine. This is a law about delaying. It's got nothing to do with what constitutes bowing. Now, the shir is place rather, I would think that is just a time frame that constitutes delaying, which you're not allowed to do, nothing to do with bowing. In order to understand this better, here's another question. We know that any shir, whether it be weight, time, that is defined around a mitzvah, those are things that halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The Rambam tells us, and in halacha l'Moshe Sinai is nitokim machlokas. Anything which is halacha l'Moshe Sinai is not open to debate. If that's the case, how could there be debates, both in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, about how long constitutes the delay out of the Beis Hamikdash or how long constitutes bowing? Those are shi'urim in zman. Surely those things are mandated by Halacha Moshe Sinai and not open to debate. So the answer is, in our context, there is a time frame. That is Halacha Moshe Sinai, but it is a generic time frame. But what is the generic time frame? As a Halacha Moshe Sinai is that a delay equals the time it takes to bow. Question is, how long is considered the time it takes to bow? That was not told clearly in the Halacha Moshe Sinai. That's exactly where the debate is. The debate is it this part of the pasuk, that part of the pasuk? So therefore, if there's a debate between the various Amiroim about which part of the pasuk is considered the length of time of Ishtachavoya, it's not just that they're arguing about which part of the pasuk it is, but rather is told the Drayafanim Svaris Anal in the Gedder from Shosh Kishishtachavoya. Each one is bringing a different part of the pasuk depending on how they view what this means. In other words, is there such a thing as Ishtachavoya not towards the Beis Hamikdash? Is there no such thing, and therefore it is only Shehiyah? So if it's that amount of time, that's when you become liable. Or is it that if it's that amount of time, it reintroduces the Ishtachavoya, even though it's not towards the Beis towards the Heichal? So in Ishtachavoya Beis Hamikdash, from Bechlal Drai Protim. To understand this better, there are three things that constitute bowing in the Beis Hamikdash. Number one, there's got to be a reason why you're bowing. Aleph. Why are you bowing? Either because, like in the pasuk, you saw the Shechina, or like on Yom Kippur, where the Kohen Gadol reads out the Eibishter's name. So that's the first thing. Why are you bowing? Number two, then there's the physical action of bowing. And then number three, Gimel, there's the length of time that you should remain in that prostrated position. Because obviously the whole purpose of bowing is that you're acknowledging the Eibishter. When you understand these three principles, then you get to what the real core is of the three-way debate about how long you're supposed to bow. So let's start at the end. Let's say that the definition of bowing is how long are you engaged in that mindset and therefore the physical prostration. Well, if I'm saying that the whole issue is the amount of time, then how long is bowing? The amount of time that is considered so-called delaying. In other words, if the whole point is how long do you bow, then I'm looking at a time frame. Doesn't matter which direction I'm bowing, I'm looking at a time frame. And therefore it's logical. As the shift from the ganze well, if I'm looking at the time frame of bowing, then there are three steps, and all of those are involved in the time frame. From when you were aroused to bow till you finish your whole meditation on the floor. That whole period, the longest possible period, that's considered bowing. But if I say that the concept of bowing is unrelated to the concept of delaying your exit, not a geder for nishtachavo, it's a concept in its own right called bowing. Well, then the time frame is only as long as it takes to actually bow, which is really short. And if I come with a third opinion, which we're saying is the Rambam's view, that you have to consider both elements. It's considered bowing when it is a certain amount of time. Well, then the action of bowing is not enough. There's got to be an element of delay which creates that hishtachavo, which makes it considered bowing. What's that delay? The amount of time that you're prostrated on the floor doing your acknowledgement of Hashem. That will explain why the Amiroim link their time frame to a particular part of the pasuk. It's not just to give us some kind of unrelated way to remember how long it should take. Now, in dem pasuk this pasuk speaks to the three considerations that form this argument. How long is considered bowing? It does say it in other words. As the shir shia is kedei ishtachavoya. Seeing as we have halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which is that the amount of time that's considered delay in the Beis Hamikdash is the same amount of time that it takes to bow. And there's nowhere that tells us specifically how long is considered bowing. As Mestaber to sagen, logic tells us as there's got to be somewhere in Torah that at least alludes to what this time frame would be. Und der Rebbe ist bei allen angenommen, als der Remes auf dem Shirstach Avoya ist in dem Posuk in Torah, wo es wird gesagt, everybody agrees that the best place to find this information would be in a Posuk that speaks about this experience of bowing as a nation in the Beis Hamikdash. Question is, in welchen Teil from Posuk moves the Shirstach Avoya? Everybody knows that's the Posuk. The question is, what part of that Posuk is describing the shir of bowing? That is Tolin Techen HaKosov. That depends on what the pasuk is saying at each of its points. And each person is going to extract the part of the pasuk that speaks to their particular svara of what bowing is all about. Let's explain. In the pasuk the pasuk really has three segments to it. There's the first part, which is the entire nation witnessed the great fire and the divine revelation. That's the catalyst that caused them to prostrate themselves. Then the then there's the middle of the pasuk that says they all bow down. That's the impure. That's describing the action of prostration. On Seva pasuk, then the last part of the pasuk is what they did while they were bowing. They acknowledge Hashem and His kindness. The that tells us the focus, that tells us the purpose of them bowing. Now we can very easily slot the three opinions into how they dissect this pasuk. The first opinion we took, which is bowing is actually part of the broader concept of time frame. How long did you stay in the Beis Hamikdash? And the time frame, therefore, of bowing is the whole process of the bowing from start to finish, from inspiration to application. Well, in that case, it's logical that how long is considered bowing? The entire pasuk and all of its message. Because the pasuk describes the whole ishtachava from start to finish. Because now you include the beginning of the pasuk, which describes why they bowed. Is thus that Teichen in Ashia Beis Hamikdash was kedet the gams and say that explains what it means to be, so to speak, sticking around in the Beis Hamikdash. That's the whole process. What caused them to bow? Seeing the fire and the divine revelation. Then the physical bowing, and the acknowledgement of Hashem that the bowing generated, which is Hodel Hashem Kitov. But if I'd say no, the definition of Ishtachava is nothing to do with Shia. That's a different halacha. The definition of bowing is bowing. Then what is mistaber? As does the from the Chelek HaKosov, where steht the Pulas Ishtachava. Well, then it's the middle of the pasuk, even though it sounds strange to only focus on the middle of the pasuk, because that's the part that describes the actual bowing. That's the part. But if you go with the third opinion, as that both things are relevant, that it is a matter of bowing, that's the transgression. How is bowing constituted? If it's as long as the shehiyah requires, well then obviously you can't only focus on the part of the pasuk that's speaking about the physical action of bowing. You also have to have the part of the pasuk that tells us what happened when they bowed and what the intention of the bowing was. That they acknowledge Hashem and His kindness. And them because that tells me it's not just a manual action of bowing, but it's an intentional concept of bowing and acknowledging Hashem. Is from Bavli and Yerushalmi, and that also helps us to understand the difference between the nature of the argument in the Talmud Bavli versus Yerushalmi. As in Bavli bringt sich die Idee kememret psuka von dem ganzen pasuk. Bavli suggests the possibility that you should that shehiyah is considered the amount of time it takes to read the whole pasuk. Mashenken Yerushalmi is an alle days no b'shayches to sefer dikra from Vayichron lehalon, whereas the Yerushalmi never considered that as a possibility. They only looked at reading the second part of the pasuk and how much should you read. Because in Babli is the Loshav Kama Shiur Shehiyah. Look at the Babli. The question was, how long is the delay associated with bowing? Was Madgesh as the Shir is in was verbunden nicht also mit dem Din Ishtachavoya. Das ist eine von Shia. In other words, the Gemara Bavli is showing that this is not about the concept of bowing as much as it is about the time frame of delaying exit. And the time frame of delaying exit we've got to look at from the beginning till the end. Yerushalmi obviously Loshanat Kami Shir Ishtachavoya. Whereas the Yerushalmi started the question by asking, how long is bowing? Therefore I have to be looking at the action and the intention of bowing. Das Ageda von Ishtachavo. It's a concept that fits into the world of bowing. Bemele werden dort gebracht nur die Deis, was lernen ab von die Chelke Akasse welche reden wegen der Piulus Ishtachavo. Therefore, the only parts of the pasuk that Yerushalmi is going to even consider are from when the bowing starts. Either just the bowing or also the intention of the bowing canal. Aber nicht as Cholas Akasse was neger nor to them get from Shia canal. But the Yerushalmi is not going to consider the first part of the pasuk because that's going to tell us a time frame. We're not looking at a time frame. We're looking at the activity of bowing. And therefore we can come back to the Rambam and say, as those was the Rambam paskent, the Rambam rules. The Rambam tells us clearly what is the time frame of bowing. Starts off from when they bowed and what they said. It's not that's not only because the Rambam is being more lenient than the opinion that says it's only the last part of the pasuk, or sorry, only the middle of the pasuk. But rather because the Rambam wants us to know that that is exactly what constitutes bowing. It's not just a mechanical movement of bowing, but it's also the idea that if it's long enough, it becomes a geder of bowing. What's long enough? That you also have, so to speak, your intention behind the bowing. Let's understand the spiritual message, because this is quite powerful. So let's understand these opinions from the perspective of Musar and Chassidus. As we know very well, the idea of prostrating ourselves in the Beis Hamikdash represents bittul legamrei, absolute bittul to the Eibishter. That a Jew completely surrenders to the Eibishter. In them, now there are three possible levels at which a person could experience this. The highest level is complete surrender, total prostration on the floor. That means that a Yid contemplates the Eibishter's greatness, and it's such a profound meditation that he could literally see the Eibishter, like at the time in the Pasuk where they saw the Eibishter. When a person has such an acute awareness of Hashem, naturally it causes a complete surrender to Hashem, represented by prostrating oneself with hands and legs spread out. Everything ganz and bottled to Eibishter, the person is totally surrendered to Hashem. It's not only an action, superficial, the entire being. He's putting his head on the floor, representing that his seichel, his ratzon, his tainig, the highest, deepest faculties of the person, completely surrendered to Hashem, and of course it translates also into action. Now, some of us may have the experience of not feeling this absolute revelation of Hashem. We don't see godliness in this acute fashion. But we still bow. We force ourselves to bow because that's what we have to do. Which means that the person doesn't have this great awareness and inspiration, but practically, I'll do what the Eibishter says. I'll surrender my own interests in favor of what Hashem wants. In the most generic sense, we could say this is the difference between living today and living in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. Because Bisman Abai is as a likus given begiloi. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, the Eibishter was very revealed. Says given re'iyas elikus. People saw godliness, like the Gemara tells us that you came to be seen, you came to see. So when you were in the Beis Hamikdash, you had this exposure to godliness, you really felt bittul in a very real way, and therefore when you bowed, it was very personal. The person completely surrendered to Hashem and completely gave up their own identity. That's not our case now. As we say in the Yom Tov davening, nowadays we don't see this obvious godliness. And therefore we cannot really see the Eibishter, we cannot really bow. Because we're not witnessing godliness, we're not able to commit ourselves completely and surrender completely. So it's not bechitzonis. Our commitment exists, but it's rather superficial. We're doing what the Eibishter wants. Now, we have our own interests and our own thoughts. But rather what we do is, like the Alter Rebbe says, we compel the body not to rebel against the Eibishter, but the deepest interests that we have are not completely surrendered to Hashem. About deep beidei, so now these two possibilities: complete surrender to Hashem. So is it the whole pasuk? I see the Eibishter, and therefore I'm completely bottled, or is it just I'm just going through the motions? Neither one of those is common to the Jewish people on a regular basis. It's the first level, which is that you're completely dedicated to the Eibishter and you're witnessing godliness, is an extremely high level that most of us will not access. It's not common for the Eibishter to be revealed, and most of us cannot reach a point of that consciousness. Whereas on the other extreme, just going through the motions and dedicating ourselves to Hashem without real emotional investment is a niedrige Madrege, und darf sich ständig bestadelt sein, sich aufzuheben davon. That's like entry level, and every one of us should aspire to transcend it. We need to reach a point where we're not just going through the motions of bowing to the Eibishter, like the Alter Rebbe says in the Torah, just to like force the body not to rebel against Hashem. We have to have some kind of intention, some kind of a sense of real bittul. That's the third type of ishtachavo which is described. When a person is just starting out in their spiritual journey, they do have to push themselves to go through the motions. But that will bring us to greater awareness where we actually acknowledge the Eibishter. We actually feel within ourselves an acknowledgement of Hashem and a bittul to Hashem. Every one of us can achieve that level. So we're not going to get to the level of seeing godliness, but every one of us can actually feel a sense of bittul. Again, to paraphrase what the Alter Rebbe says in the Torah, not every one of us has the power to generate within ourselves this absolute bittul that comes from the depth of our souls. Simultaneously, those the Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya, within the nature of our soul, every one of us has a capacity for bittul to Hashem. It's not completely foreign to us. It's not just mechanical. And therefore every one of us has the capacity and therefore the responsibility to awaken this part of ourselves. Just the fact that a Yid overcomes their natural inclinations and surrenders to the Eibishter, that will elicit this inner dedication to Hashem that we all have because of our neshamas. And this dovetails beautifully with the Rambam's shita about Jews. And therefore, when the Rambam wants to tell us the halacha, and halacha has to speak to the majority of people, he says, how long is the time frame of bowing? The part that speaks about the mechanical bowing to Hashem, and the part that speaks about intention. Also the part about praising Hashem, that is the measure of bowing. In other words, as the ishtachavo is mit a gewisse shehiyah, by im is, in other words, it's bowing technically, but it also has this element of shehiyah, of like kind of being caught up in the experience. As by im is do nit nodin a kudas ishtachavo be mais vayichra apay mas vayishtachvu. Not only are you doing the action of bowing, but you're feeling a sense of acknowledging Hashem's greatness and therefore your dedication to Him. Rambam Shita, this is the Rambam following his shita about Jews. Because the Rambam speaks about the Jew who you have to take to the secular courts to force him to do what the Torah requires. Still says the Rambam is that Jew wants to fulfill every mitzvah and stay away from every avera. And that is his true intention. Therefore, even if we compel him, Roitzani is no mitzadik kfir b'shoitim. And as far as we could tell, the fact that now he's screaming, okay, I want to do this, is only because he really doesn't want to be beaten any further. Is no mitzadik. It says clear be'alma b'chitzonis. It looks like he's just going through the actions. Paskin the Rambam azad Rabbi ein ze onus mimenu says no yitzur shetokve became shokal at shetoshash yitzrei v'omer roitzani kvar gorish l'ritzoinai. The Rambam paskins lehalocha. It's not that this person is being now forced into a situation. It's rather that his Yetzer Hara had overtaken him, and now he's illustrating his true will, which is to do what the Eibusha wants, in this case to divorce his wife. He's bowing because deep down that's what he wants to do. Therefore, we can insist from every person, as in the that even when we're just going through the motion of bowing to the Eibishter, that should be a catalyst to illustrate to us, firstly, and then publicly, that we are completely dedicated to the Eibishter. This is what we're going to say. We're actually going to say it. I am dedicated to the Eibishter deep down. And through our efforts, very cautiously and gently, to get every single yid to weaken the Yetzer Hara. Because think about it, even just to compel the Yetzer Hara needs a whole Beis Din. And we have to coax out of the Jewish person their truest ratzon, which is that every yid wants to do every mitzvah and avoid every avera. Is das noch Beis Hamikdash that speeds up the restoration of the third Beis Hamikdash. When every yid will have access to go at the three major Yom Tovs to the Beis Hamikdash, will be able to see the Eibishter clearly and therefore bow with complete submission. In the Beis Hamikdash, that should happen immediately.